Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, or if someone you loved kept a secret that changed everything, please leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Your stories remind me that none of us walk through pain alone. The morning of my husband's funeral began like the slowest sunrise of my life. The sky was pale and quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy instead of peaceful. I remember standing in front of my bedroom mirror, staring at a woman I'd barely recognized. My eyes were swollen, my face older somehow, as if grief had carved new lines into me overnight. I was 54 years old, a wife of 31 years, and a widow for exactly 6 days. That word still felt foreign, widow. I said it silently to myself, and it echoed in my chest like an empty room. His suit was already waiting in the funeral home. I had chosen it myself, navy blue, the one he wore to our daughter's graduation. I kept thinking about how strange it was that I could pick out his clothes one last time, but I couldn't pick out the ending to our story. Death had done that for me, sudden and unapologetic. A heart attack, they said, quick, no suffering. People told me I should be grateful for that, as if there was anything grateful about losing the man you plan to grow old with. Our house felt hollow without him. Every sound echoed. The refrigerator hum, the ticking clock, even my own breathing felt too loud. I moved through the morning like I was underwater, putting on my black dress, fastening the pearl necklace he'd given me on our 20th anniversary. My hands trembled when I clasped it. I told myself to breathe. Just get through today, I thought. Just get through today. Friends and family had already started calling, checking in, asking if I needed anything, telling me they loved me. I answered politely, automatically, like I was reading from a script. Thank you. Yes, I'm holding up. We'll see you at the service. Each call ended the same way, with silence on the other end, as if they were waiting for me to break. But I didn't. Not yet. When I arrived at the funeral home, the parking lot was already half full. I sat in my car for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel, my forehead pressed against it. This was real. This was happening. I was about to walk into a room where my husband lay in a box, where people would look at me with pity, where my life before would be officially over. I whispered his name under my breath, a habit I didn't realize I'd already formed. And then I opened the door. Inside, everything smelled like flowers and polished wood. Soft music played in the background, something instrumental and gentle. Our children were already there. Our son hugged me tightly, his shoulders shaking. Our daughter held my hand like she used to when she was little, her thumb rubbing circles into my palm. I tried to be strong for them. I really did. I kept telling myself that today wasn't just about my pain. It was about theirs, too. People came up to me one by one, old friends, co-workers, neighbors. They told stories about my husband, how kind he was, how dependable, how lucky I was to have him. I nodded and smiled through tears, thanking them, letting their words wash over me without really sinking in. Lucky. That word would haunt me later. I stood near the casket, greeting people, when I noticed her. At first, she was just another face in the crowd, a woman in a black coat, standing a little too close, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. She wasn't crying like the others. She looked composed, sad, yes, but in a restrained way, like someone holding something back. I tried to place her. Maybe a coworker, maybe a distant relative. My husband had known a lot of people. Still, there was something about the way she looked at him, at the casket, that felt different, personal. I pushed the thought aside. Today was not the day for suspicion. Today was about mourning. As the service began, everyone took their seats. I sat in the front row with my children, clutching a tissue in my hand. The pastor spoke about love and legacy, about the life my husband had lived. I listened, but my mind wandered. Memories floated in and out. Our first apartment, late-night talks at the kitchen table, arguments that ended in laughter, ordinary moments that now felt sacred. Then, halfway through the service, I felt it again, that sensation of being watched. I turned my head slightly, scanning the rows behind me, and my eyes met hers, the woman in black. This time she didn't look away. Our eyes locked for a second too long. Her gaze was filled with something I couldn't name yet. Grief, yes, but also recognition, as if she knew me, as if she had been waiting for this moment. After the service, people lined up to pay their final respects. I stood beside the casket, my hand resting on its smooth surface, saying quiet goodbyes. When it was over, when the room started to empty, she approached me. Up close, she was around my age, maybe a few years younger. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her face pale but composed. She held a small bouquet of lilies, her hands trembling slightly. She stopped in front of me, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said softly. Her voice was gentle, almost careful. I nodded. "Thank you," I replied automatically. She hesitated, like she was weighing something heavy. Then she took a breath. "I loved him," she said. The words hit me, but not the way they would later. People say that at funerals all the time, I thought. He was loved by many. "He was easy to love," I said, forcing a small smile. She swallowed hard. "He was my husband." The room seemed to tilt. For a split second, I thought I had misheard her. My ears rang, a high-pitched sound that drowned out everything else. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes filled with tears then, finally. "We were married," she repeated, "for 12 years. 12 years. The number echoed in my head like a drumbeat. 12 years ago, my husband and I celebrated our 19th anniversary. 12 years ago, we were planning a family vacation, arguing over paint colors for the living room, talking about the future like it was a shared thing. I laughed. I didn't mean to. It just slipped out, sharp and brittle. "That's not possible," I said. "I'm his wife." She swallowed hard. "I know," she said. "I didn't know about you at first. I swear I didn't." The world narrowed to the space between us. The sounds of the funeral home faded away. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. "What are you saying?" I asked. She reached into her purse with shaking hands and pulled out a folded document, a marriage certificate, her name, his name, a date that made my stomach drop. It was real, official, signed. I stared at it, my vision blurring. My hands felt numb. This couldn't be happening, not today, not here. "You're lying," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "This has to be some kind of mistake." "I wish it was," she whispered. I don't remember much after that. I remember my daughter calling my name, her voice panicked. I remember sitting down suddenly, my legs unable to hold me. I remember the woman stepping back, tears streaming down her face, as if she was the one who had been wronged. My husband, the man I thought I knew, the man I mourned, the man whose body lay just a few feet away, he had lived an entire other life, and I was finding out at his funeral.
I don't know how long I sat there before someone helped me to my feet. My daughter's arms were around me, her face pale with fear, her eyes searching mine for answers I didn't have yet. People were staring, whispering. The woman in black stood off to the side, frozen, clutching her purse like a lifeline. I felt exposed, like something private had been ripped open in front of strangers. I wanted to scream at her, to demand she leave, to rewind time to before she spoke those words, but I didn't. I couldn't. My body felt disconnected from my mind, like I was watching myself from a distance. "I need air," I said, though it came out hoarse. My son guided me outside, past the flowers and condolences, into the cold afternoon. The sky had darkened, clouds gathering low and heavy. It felt fitting. I leaned against the brick wall of the funeral home, gulping in air like I had been underwater too long. My children hovered, asking questions all at once. "Mom, what happened? Who was that woman? Are you okay?" "I don't know," I said, honestly. I I need a minute." They exchanged worried glances, but they nodded. They'd always respected my need to gather myself, even when they were young. I closed my eyes and pressed my hand to my chest, feeling my heart race. Another wife. 12 years. The words replayed over and over, refusing to settle into something that made sense. When I opened my eyes again, she was standing a few feet away, the other woman. She hesitated, clearly unsure if she should approach. Part of me wanted to tell her to go away, to vanish back into whatever shadow she had come from. But another part of me, a quieter, steadier part, needed answers. I needed to understand how my life had split in two without me noticing. "It's okay," I said softly, surprising myself. "We should talk." My children stiffened. "Mom," my son started, but I held up a hand. "Please," I said, "just give me a few minutes." Reluctantly, they stepped back, keeping us in sight. The woman and I stood there, two widows bound by the same man, the same loss, the same betrayal. She introduced herself. Her name was Clara. Saying her name felt strange in my mouth, like learning a new language I never wanted to speak. "I never meant for this to come out like this," she said, her voice shaking. "I tried to reach you before, but I didn't know how. And then he died, and I thought you deserved to know." I nodded slowly. "How?" I asked. "How did this even happen?" She took a deep breath, as if bracing herself. "I met him at a conference," she said, 14 years ago. He told me he was divorced, said it was messy, that his ex-wife lived in another state, that they barely spoke. I believed him. I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat. Divorced. Another lie to add to the pile. "And you never questioned it?" I asked. "I did, quickly, at first. But he had answers for everything. Phone calls he took outside, weekends he said he was traveling for work. He showed me documents, even introduced me to friends who knew him as single. I didn't find out about you until years later." My heart clenched. "And when you did?" She looked down at her hands. "By then, we were already married. I confronted him. He cried. He begged, said he was trapped, that he didn't know how to leave without destroying everyone. He promised he would fix it. Someday." Someday. The word tasted sour. I had lived my life with him in the present, believing in a future that apparently included lies layered so carefully I never saw the cracks. "Why didn't you leave?" I asked, my voice quieter now. She looked up at me, tears spilling over. "Because I loved him," she said, "and because I was scared. Scared of starting over, scared of being alone, scared that if I walked away, I'd have nothing to show for those years." Her words hit too close to home. I understood fear. I understood staying longer than you should because leaving feels like failure. Still, understanding didn't erase the anger simmering beneath my grief. "So you stayed, and so did I, and he got to have both." She nodded, shame etched into her features. "Yes." We stood there in silence, the weight of his choices settling between us. Finally, I asked the question that had been clawing at me since she spoke. "Did you have children with him?" She shook her head. "No. He said he was done having kids, that he'd already raised his." I thought of our son and daughter, of the bedtime stories and scraped knees, of all the milestones he'd shared with us while living another life somewhere else. The deception felt endless, like a hallway with no doors. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I don't remember the drive to the cemetery or the way the dirt sounded as it hit the casket. I remember my daughter squeezing my hand so tightly it hurt. I remember feeling numb, hollowed out, as if grief had hollowed me and betrayal had moved in. That night, after everyone left and the house was quiet again, I sat alone at the kitchen table. His chair across from me was empty, pushed in neatly like he'd be back any minute. I stared at it, half expecting him to walk in and explain everything, to laugh and say it was some terrible mistake. But he didn't. He never would. I poured myself a glass of water and let the memories come. The late nights he claimed were meetings, the weekends he said were business trips, the unexplained charges on our credit card that he brushed off as errors. All the little moments I had ignored because trusting him was easier than questioning him. I felt foolish, angry at myself for not seeing it sooner. But beneath that anger was something deeper, sadness for the years I had lived in good faith while he lived in fragments. The next few days were filled with logistics, death certificates, insurance calls, sorting through his belongings. Each task felt mechanical, something to check off a list, until I reached his desk. It was locked. He'd always kept it that way, saying it was for work, that it helped him focus. I had never pressed him. Now, my hands hovered over the key ring, my heart pounding. The key slid into the lock easily. The drawer opened with a soft click. Inside were neatly stacked folders, a few old notebooks, and an envelope with my name on it. My full name, written in his familiar handwriting. My stomach twisted as I picked it up. I sat down and opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, several pages long. I recognized his voice immediately before I finished the first line. He wrote about loving me, about being sorry, about being weak. He admitted to the second marriage, to the lies, to the way he'd convinced himself he could keep both lives separate, intact. He said he never meant to hurt me, that he planned to tell me someday, that he just needed the right moment. There it was again, someday. I read the letter twice, then a third time, each word carving a deeper ache into my chest. He talked about fear, about not wanting to lose me, about convincing himself that as long as I was happy, the truth didn't matter. He said he hoped I could forgive him. He said he hoped I would understand. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Forgiveness felt like a distant concept, something theoretical rather than real. Understanding felt heavier. Understanding meant accepting that the man I loved was capable of this, that our marriage existed alongside another, unseen, but just as real. Later that evening, my phone buzzed, a message from Clara. She asked if I was okay, if we could talk again sometime. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Part of me resented her deeply. Another part recognized that she too was manipulated, strung along by the same promises and lies. I typed back slowly. I don't know what comes next, I wrote, but I think we both deserve the truth. As I set the phone down, I realized something that startled me. My grief had shifted. It was still there, heavy and persistent, but it was no longer just about losing my husband. It was about losing the version of my life I thought was real, about grieving a marriage that, in some ways, had never fully existed. That night, lying alone in bed, I stared at the ceiling and made myself a quiet promise. I would not let his secrets define the rest of my life. I would face the truth, no matter how painful, and I would decide for myself what healing looked like. I didn't know how yet. I just knew I wasn't done. The morning after I read his letter, I woke up with a headache that felt like it stretched from temple to temple. Grief had a way of settling into my body, making itself known in aches and tightness. I lay there for a while, staring at the familiar crack in the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. It was strange how normal everything looked, how the sun still rose and birds still chirped, as if my world hadn't cracked open at a funeral. I got out of bed and made coffee out of habit. 2 cups. I froze when I realized what I'd done, then quietly poured one down the sink. That small act broke something in me, and I leaned against the counter, letting the tears come. Not loud, dramatic sobs, but slow, steady tears that soaked into the sleeve of my robe. I cried for the man I lost, for the woman I thought I was, and for the years that suddenly felt tainted. Later that morning, Clara called. I watched my phone ring for a long time before answering. My instinct was to protect myself, to retreat, but curiosity and a need for clarity pushed me forward. "Hello?" I said cautiously. "Thank you for picking up," she replied. Her voice was quiet, tentative. "I didn't want to intrude. I wanted to check on you." "I'm managing," I said. It was the most honest answer I had. "What did you want to talk about?" There was a pause. "I think we should meet," she said, "if you're willing. There are things you deserve to know." I hesitated. The thought of sitting across from her, of hearing more details about his other life, made my stomach churn. But part of me knew that avoiding it wouldn't make it go away. "Okay," I said finally, "we can meet." We chose a small cafe halfway between our neighborhoods, neutral ground. When I arrived, she was already there, seated near the window, her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. She stood when she saw me, uncertainty written all over her face. We exchanged an awkward nod and sat down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The clink of dishes and low murmur of other conversations filled the space between us. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said at last. "I believe you," I replied, surprising both of us. "But believing that doesn't make this easier." She nodded. "I know." Over the next hour, she told me about their life together, the apartment he kept across town, the routines they shared, the holidays he split with excuses and half-truths. Each detail felt like a small cut, but I forced myself to listen. This was the truth I had asked for. I noticed how careful she was with her words, how she avoided sounding sentimental, as if she was afraid of rubbing salt into my wounds. When she finished, I took a sip of my coffee, now cold. "Did he ever talk about me?" I asked. "Yes," she said softly. "Often. He said you were kind, strong, that you deserved better than the mess he'd made." I let out a bitter laugh, and yet he kept lying. "Yes," she agreed, "he did." We sat in silence again, two women piecing together the same puzzle from opposite sides. Finally, I asked, "What are you going to do now?" She looked down at her hands. "I don't know," she admitted. "I built my life around him. Now I have to figure out who I am without that." Her words echoed my own thoughts. After we parted ways, I drove home feeling drained but oddly lighter. Knowing didn't erase the pain, but it gave it shape. It made it something I could face instead of a shadow lurking in the corners of my mind. The following weeks were a lesson in endurance. People stopped calling as often, meals went uneaten. I sorted through closets and drawers, deciding what to keep and what to give away. Each item carried a memory. Some were comforting, others felt like betrayals all on their own. One afternoon, while organizing paperwork, I discovered another envelope tucked behind old tax documents. This one wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Clara. My hands shook when I opened it, my chest tightening with dread. Inside was a second letter, similar in tone to the one he'd written me. Apologies, confessions, promises that now meant nothing. He had written to both of us, trying to smooth over the damage he'd caused, even in death. I sat back in my chair, holding both letters in my lap, and felt a wave of anger unlike anything I'd felt before. Not the sharp anger of discovery, but a deeper, steadier rage at his cowardice. Even now, he had tried to manage our emotions, to control the narrative, to make himself seem less culpable. That night, I called my sister. I hadn't told her everything yet. I hadn't told many people. There was shame wrapped up in this, a fear of judgment, of whispers. But I needed someone who knew me, who could hear the truth without flinching. When I finished explaining, there was a long pause on the other end. "Oh, honey," she said finally, "I'm so sorry." "So am I replied, "for all of it." She listened as I talked through my confusion, my anger, my grief. She didn't rush me or try to fix it. She just let me speak, which was exactly what I needed. By the end of the call, I felt steadier, grounded by the reminder that I wasn't as alone as I sometimes felt. The following days, my daughter came over. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd read his letter. She looked at me with concern and curiosity. "Mom," she said gently, "do you want to talk about it?" I nodded. We talked for hours about her father, about the man she loved, and the man I had discovered. She cried, I cried. We held each other and acknowledged that our grief was layered now, complicated by truths we couldn't ignore. She asked questions I didn't have answers to. I told her the truth when I could, and when I couldn't, I said so. "I'm proud of you," she said at one point. "For what?" I asked. "For facing this," she said, "for not pretending it didn't happen." Her words stayed with me. Facing it. That became my quiet mantra. Each day I faced another piece of the reality he'd left behind. Some days were harder than others. Some days I felt almost normal. Other days, the weight of it all pressed down on me until I could barely move. Slowly, something began to change. The sharp edges of my anger dulled a little. The constant ache in my chest eased just a little. I started taking walks in the evening, letting the movement clear my head. I noticed the world again, the smell of rain, the sound of laughter from a neighbor's yard. Small things, but grounding ones. One evening, as I walked past a park, I saw a woman sitting alone on a bench staring at her phone. For a split second, I thought it was Clara. It wasn't, but the moment made me realize something important. I didn't see her as an enemy anymore. I saw her as another casualty of his choices. That realization didn't excuse her role, but it softened my anger. Back at home, I pulled out both letters again and read them one last time. Then I did something that surprised me. I tore them up, slowly, deliberately. I watched the pieces fall into the trash, feeling a strange sense of relief. Those letters didn't get to define my healing. I did. As I went to bed that night, I felt tired but resolute. I couldn't change what he'd done. I couldn't rewrite our past, but I could choose how much space his betrayal took up in my future. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt like that future belonged to me again. The weeks that followed felt quieter, not because the pain was gone, but because I had learned how to carry it without letting it spill everywhere. Grief had settled into something steadier, like a low hum instead of a siren. I still missed him. That truth didn't disappear just because I learned about his lies. Loving someone for 3 decades doesn't evaporate overnight. But the love had changed shape. It no longer felt like something I owed him. It felt like something I was slowly reclaiming for myself. One afternoon, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. It was a lawyer. He introduced himself politely and explained that my husband had left instructions regarding his estate. The word estate made my stomach tighten. We weren't wealthy, but we had a home, savings, a life built piece by piece over years of work and compromise. There may be some complexities, the lawyer said carefully. I knew what he meant before he said it. Another wife, I replied flatly. There was a pause. Yes, he said, that is part of it. We scheduled a meeting. When I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall, feeling the familiar mix of anger and exhaustion rise again. Even now, he was complicating my life. Even now, I had to untangle the mess he'd left behind. At the lawyer's office, I learned what I had half expected. My husband had divided certain assets between Clara and me. The apartment he'd shared with her was in her name. The house I lived in was in mine. Our savings had been split in a way that suggested he tried to be fair, as if fairness could be calculated after decades of deceit. There was no will contest, no dramatic courtroom battle, just paperwork and quiet conversations that carried the weight of his decisions. Clara was there too. We sat across from each other at a long table, our chairs slightly angled away, like we were still unsure how close we were allowed to be. She looked tired, older than the last time I'd seen her. Loss had a way of doing that. When the lawyer left us alone to review documents, neither of us spoke first. Finally, she cleared her throat. I don't want to fight you, she said carefully. I don't want this to be another thing he ruins. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a woman who had lost just as much as I had. Different losses, yes, but real ones all the same. Neither do I said, and I meant it. We signed the papers without argument. When it was over, we walked out together, standing awkwardly on the sidewalk. Take care of yourself, she said. You too, I replied. That might have been the end of our story together, and for a while, it was. Life continued in small, practical ways. I paid bills, I cooked meals, I attended family gatherings where people avoided the topic, unsure of what to say. I let them. I didn't need their commentary. I needed space to breathe. One evening, my son came over unannounced. He sat down heavily on the couch, his face tense. Mom, he said, I'm angry. I know, I said softly. He continued, I keep thinking about him, about what he did, and I don't know how to reconcile that with the dad I knew. I reached over and took his hand. You don't have to reconcile it right now. You're allowed to feel both things. Love and anger can exist in the same space. He nodded slowly, tears welling in his eyes. How are you so calm? He asked. I thought about the question for a moment. I'm not always, I said, but I've learned that carrying rage every day doesn't punish him, it only punishes me. That became another quiet lesson I carried with me. Anger had its place. It helped me recognize the injustice of what he'd done, but living inside it would keep me tethered to him in a way I no longer wanted. As months passed, I started to do things just for myself. I took a painting class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but never made time for. I wasn't particularly good at it, but I loved the way time seemed to disappear when I focused on the canvas. I started meeting friends for lunch again, laughing without guilt, realizing that joy didn't mean I was forgetting him. One afternoon, as I was leaving the class, I saw Clara in the parking lot. She looked surprised to see me, then smiled hesitantly. Hi, she said. Hi, I replied. We stood there for a moment, the past hovering between us. I've been thinking about you, she said. I hope that's not strange. It's not, I said. I've thought about you too. She took a breath. I'm moving, she said, starting over somewhere new. That sounds healthy, I said, and meant it. Before she left, she hesitated. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, not just for what happened, but for my part in it, even if I didn't know at first. I looked at her, feeling the weight of the moment. Forgiveness is a complicated thing. It isn't a single decision, it's a process. Thank you, I said. I'm still working through everything, but I appreciate your honesty. She nodded, relief flickering across her face. As she walked away, I felt something loosen in my chest. Closure doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in quiet acknowledgments like that. That night, I sat on the porch, watching the sky darken. I thought about my marriage, about the years that were real and the years that were built on lies. I realized that both could be true. The love we shared was genuine, even if it hadn't been exclusive. That didn't excuse his choices, but it allowed me to hold my memories without poisoning them. I spoke out loud then, just to the empty air. I said to the empty air, I release you. Not in anger, not in bitterness, just as a statement of fact. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter. Not healed, but hopeful. Healing, I was learning, isn't about erasing the past. It's about making peace with it, about choosing how you carry it forward. I began volunteering at a local support group for women dealing with betrayal and loss. I listened more than I spoke. When I did share my story, I saw recognition in their eyes. I saw relief. Pain has a way of isolating us, convincing us we're the only ones. Being able to say, "Me too," became a gift I didn't know I needed. Through those conversations, I found my voice again, not as a wife defined by her husband's actions, but as a woman who had endured and grown. I learned that dignity isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It's quiet and steady, rooted in self-respect. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about him, about the life we planned, about the secrets he kept. Those thoughts no longer consume me. They pass through like clouds, leaving space for something new. I don't know what the rest of my life will look like. I don't have all the answers. But I know this. I am more than the sum of his choices. I am not defined by the lies told behind my back. I am defined by how I chose to face the truth when it finally came. And that, I've learned, is enough. As the first year without him unfolded, I began to notice the subtle ways grief changed its rhythm. Anniversaries hit harder than random days. His birthday arrived quietly, marked by a dull ache instead of the sharp pain I'd braced for. I lit a candle that evening, not as a ritual of longing, but as an acknowledgement of what had been. I sat at the kitchen table and allowed myself to remember him without rewriting the truth. Both could exist, the good and the broken, the love and the deception. Learning to hold those opposites without tearing myself apart became part of my healing. People often assume healing means forgetting. It doesn't. It means integrating. It means learning how to carry the story without letting it define every step you take. I was still learning, still stumbling some days. There were mornings I woke up feeling strangely peaceful, only to be ambushed by a memory triggered by a song on the radio or a familiar cologne in a grocery aisle. I learned to let those moments pass. I didn't fight them anymore. Fighting only made them louder. My daughter called one evening, her voice hesitant. "Mom," she said, "I've been thinking about Dad, about everything, and I don't know how to talk about it with my friends. They either defend him or act like he was a monster. He was neither." "You're right," I said gently. "He was a complicated man who made very harmful choices." She exhaled, relief evident even through the phone. I just needed to hear that. We talked for a long time that night, about boundaries, about honesty, about how secrets corrode relationships slowly, quietly, until one day everything collapses. She told me she was learning what she wanted in her own relationships now, what she would and wouldn't tolerate. It struck me then that my story, painful as it was, might still serve a purpose, not as a cautionary tale drenched in bitterness, but as a lesson in self-worth and truth. Around that time, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Clara. I hadn't heard from her since she moved. The envelope was plain, her handwriting neat and careful. I hesitated before opening it, unsure of what emotions it might stir. Inside, she wrote about her new city, her new job, the way starting over felt both terrifying and freeing. She thanked me for my grace, for not turning her into the enemy. She said she was learning to forgive herself, slowly. I sat with that letter for a long time. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't just something we offer others, it's something we learn to offer ourselves. I wrote back, wishing her well, keeping my words kind but measured. Our connection didn't need to be deep to be meaningful. Sometimes closure is simply knowing the other person is trying to heal too. That summer, I took my first solo trip. Nothing extravagant, just a small coastal town a few hours away. I rented a modest room near the water and spent my days walking along the shore, letting the sound of waves steady my thoughts. There was something grounding about the ocean, about its constant movement and unchanging presence. It reminded me that life continues regardless of our personal storms. One evening, I sat on the sand watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I felt a familiar ache then, a loneliness that had nothing to do with being alone and everything to do with the life I once shared. But alongside it was something new, acceptance. I whispered his name into the wind, not as a plea, but as a goodbye that had taken time to form. When I returned home, I noticed how different the house felt. It was still the same walls, the same furniture, but it no longer felt like a museum of our marriage. I'd begun to make it my own. New curtains, rearranged shelves, small changes that signaled a shift inside me. I wasn't erasing him, I was making room for myself. At the support group, a woman shared her story through tears one evening. She spoke of discovering her husband's long-term affair and the shame that followed. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't offer advice, I offered presence. I told her that the shock fades, that the questions eventually quiet, that dignity can survive even the deepest betrayal. I watched her shoulders relax as she listened, as if hope had found a small crack to slip through. After the meeting, she pulled me aside. "How did you stop blaming yourself?" she asked. I thought about it. "I didn't stop overnight," I said, "but I learned this. His choices were about his character, not my worth. Once I truly believed that, the self-blame lost its grip." Saying it out loud reinforced it for me too. Healing is rarely linear. Sometimes we teach ourselves the lesson by teaching it to others. On the anniversary of his death, I visited the cemetery alone. I brought fresh flowers and stood quietly, letting the weight of the day settle around me. I didn't speak much. There was nothing left to say that mattered. Instead, I focused on my breath, on the way the breeze moved through the trees. I felt sadness, yes, but it was gentle now, like an old bruise rather than an open wound. As I turned to leave, I felt something I hadn't expected. Gratitude. Not for what he did, but for what I had learned in the aftermath, about resilience, about truth, about the strength I didn't know I had until I needed it. Driving home, I realized how far I'd come from that day at the funeral, from the moment the ground had shifted beneath my feet and nothing made sense. I hadn't just survived that moment, I had grown through it. The betrayal no longer defined my days. It had become part of my story, but not the ending. That evening, I cooked myself a simple dinner and ate at the table, savoring the quiet. I thought about the future, about the possibility of companionship someday, about the boundaries I would insist on, the honesty I would demand. I wasn't afraid of loving again. I was wiser now, more attuned to my own needs. Before bed, I wrote in my journal, something I'd taken up during those early months of grief. I wrote about forgiveness, about how it doesn't mean excusing harm, it means releasing yourself from the burden of carrying someone else's guilt. I wrote about dignity, about choosing peace over bitterness is an act of strength, not weakness. As I closed the journal, I felt a sense of completion settle over me. Not an ending exactly, but a closing of a chapter that had taken time and courage to finish. My life wasn't what I'd planned. It wasn't the story I thought I was living, but it was still mine. If there is one lesson I carry forward, it's this. Truth may arrive late, and it may arrive painfully, but it also carries the seed of freedom. When we face it fully and honestly, we give ourselves permission to rebuild on solid ground. I turned off the light and lay in the darkness feeling calm, not because everything was perfect, but because I trusted myself to navigate whatever came next. And for the first time in a long while, that trust felt unshakable. Life has a way of testing whether the lessons we think we've learned have truly settled into our bones. Just when I began to feel steady, just when the ground beneath me felt solid again, a reminder would surface, quiet, unannounced, asking me to choose who I was becoming. It happened one afternoon when I was sorting through an old storage box in the garage, looking for nothing in particular. Dust clung to my fingers as I lifted out forgotten things, outdated paperwork, a cracked picture frame, a stack of cards from anniversaries long past. At the bottom of the box was a small, leather-bound notebook I didn't recognize. I sat down on the concrete floor and opened it. The pages were filled with his handwriting. Not letters this time, not apologies, but journal entries, dates, fragments of thoughts, confessions never meant for anyone else. My first instinct was to close it. I had already learned enough. But curiosity, that old dangerous companion, nudged me forward. What I read wasn't dramatic. There were no shocking revelations left to uncover. Instead, there was a portrait of a man deeply divided against himself. He wrote about guilt, about loving two women in different ways and convincing himself that meant he wasn't truly harming either. He wrote about fear, fear of confrontation, fear of being alone, fear of being seen as the villain. Page after page, it became clear that his greatest loyalty had always been to his own comfort. I closed the notebook and sat there for a long time, not angry, not even especially sad, just clear. The journal didn't reopen old wounds, it sealed them. It confirmed what I had already come to accept. His betrayal wasn't a momentary lapse, it was a pattern of avoidance, a lifetime of choosing the easier lie over the harder truth. That night, I burned the notebook in the fireplace. I watched the pages curl and darken, the ink disappearing into ash. It felt ceremonial, intentional. I wasn't destroying evidence, I was releasing weight I no longer needed to carry. In the months that followed, I noticed something unexpected. People began coming to me. Friends of friends, women I barely knew. They had heard my story through quiet channels, and they came not for gossip, but for reassurance. One woman sat across from me at a coffee shop, her hands shaking as she told me about discovering her husband's secret messages. "She's stupid," she whispered. I leaned forward and met her eyes. "You're not stupid," I said. "You trusted someone who asked for that trust. That's not a flaw." Saying those words felt like speaking to a younger version of myself. Each time I offered compassion to someone else, I felt it deepen within me too. One evening, my son called again. He sounded lighter than he had in months. "I went to therapy today," he said. I smiled. "How was it?" "Hard," he admitted, "but good. I realized I've been afraid of becoming like him." "That fear," I said gently, "means you're already choosing differently." We talked about cycles, about how honesty is a daily practice, not a single promise. When we hung up, I felt a quiet pride, not just in him, but in the way our family was learning to speak truths we once tiptoed around. As autumn arrived, I found myself standing at another threshold. A man from my painting class asked if I'd like to have dinner sometime. It wasn't dramatic. He wasn't charming in a sweeping cinematic way. He was kind, present, direct. I felt my body tense instinctively, old fears rising up, whispering warnings. I didn't say yes right away. I didn't say no either. That night, I sat with the question. Was I avoiding connection out of wisdom or out of fear? The answer mattered. I realized then that healing didn't mean closing myself off forever. It meant choosing consciously with eyes open and boundaries intact. I agreed to dinner. It was simple. We talked about books, about travel, about the quiet pleasures of routine. There were no grand declarations, no promises, and that, strangely, felt comforting. I noticed how he listened without interrupting, how he didn't flinch when I mentioned my past. When we parted ways, I felt calm, not swept away, not anxious, just calm. Later, alone in my car, I laughed softly. Peace, I realized, was my new measure. Not intensity, not passion fueled by uncertainty. Peace. Weeks passed. We continued seeing each other slowly, intentionally. I shared my story in pieces when I felt ready. He never pushed. And when something felt unfamiliar or unsettling inside me, I spoke up. Each time I felt myself choosing a different path than the one I'd walked before. One night, after he left, I stood in my living room and looked around. The space felt warm, lived in, mine. I thought about the woman I had been at the funeral, blindsided and shattered. I wish I could reach back through time and place a hand on her shoulder, tell her that she would survive this, that she would become stronger without hardening, softer without breaking. I didn't hate my husband anymore. I didn't love him the way I once did either. What I felt now was a quiet acknowledgement of who he had been and who he hadn't managed to become. I had released the need for him to have been different. That release freed me in ways I hadn't expected. On the anniversary of the day I met Clara at the funeral, I took myself out for breakfast. I sat by the window, sipping coffee, watching people hurry past. No one there knew my story, and yet I carried it with me, not as a burden, but as a testament to my endurance. I thought about the strange way truth had arrived in my life, not gently, not gradually, but all at once in a moment that split my world open. And yet, through that rupture, something honest had finally entered, something solid. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's not that betrayal is inevitable or that love is dangerous. It's that self-respect must be louder than fear, that silence can protect a lie just as easily as it can protect peace, and that dignity isn't something we're given by others, it's something we claim when we decide we deserve better. I stood up, paid my bill, and stepped outside into the crisp air. The day stretched ahead of me, ordinary and full of possibility. I breathed it in, grateful for the woman I had become, one who could hold grief and hope in the same hands without dropping either. And as I walked to my car, I felt something settle deep within me. Not closure in the way stories like to promise, but something truer. Acceptance, strength, and the quiet confidence that whatever truths awaited me in the future, I would meet them standing. Time didn't stop testing me, but it stopped ambushing me. The surprises that came now felt gentler, like reminders instead of blows. I learned that healing isn't about reaching a finish line where pain disappears. It's about learning how to live fully even when pain once lived there. By the time winter arrived again, I felt rooted in myself in a way I never had before. The holidays were the hardest milestone I hadn't yet faced. The first Thanksgiving without him had been a blur of polite smiles and quiet tears. But this second year felt different. I hosted dinner at my house, something I hadn't had the courage to do before. I set the table carefully, using the good dishes, not because it was a special occasion, but because I finally believed ordinary days deserved beauty too. My children arrived early to help. My daughter chopped vegetables while my son handled the turkey, filling the kitchen with warmth and noise. Laughter bounced off the walls, and for the first time, it didn't feel like betrayal to enjoy it. It felt like survival turning into living. At one point, my daughter caught me watching them with a soft smile. "You okay, Mom?" she asked. "I am," I said, and I meant it. After dinner, when the dishes were done and the house was quiet again, I sat alone in the living room with a blanket over my legs. The fire crackled softly. I thought about how different this season felt compared to the year before. I wasn't bracing myself anymore. I was present. A few days later, I received another unexpected message. This time, it was from a woman in the support group. She told me my words had given her the courage to leave a marriage that had been quietly breaking her spirit. I read her message twice, tears gathering in my eyes. Pain, I realized, doesn't just break us. Sometimes it turns us into a bridge for someone else. As winter deepened, my relationship with the man from the painting class continued to unfold slowly. There was no rush, no pressure. We spent time together in ways that felt grounded: walks, shared meals, long conversations that didn't leave me questioning where I stood. One evening, as we sat on opposite ends of a couch, he reached for my hand and asked, "Is this okay?" That question alone told me everything I needed to know. I nodded, feeling a calm certainty settle in my chest. Trust, I was learning, is rebuilt in small moments of respect, not grand declarations. Still, I remained vigilant, not in a fearful way, but in a conscious one. I checked in with myself often. How do I feel right now? Safe, heard, free to speak. Those answers mattered more than butterflies ever had. One afternoon, while cleaning out a hallway closet, I came across an old photo album. It held pictures from the early years of my marriage, younger faces, easier smiles. I flipped through it slowly, letting the memories come and go without judgment. I didn't feel the urge to throw it away or hide it. Those years were real. They shaped me, and acknowledging that no longer threatened my sense of self. I closed the album and placed it back on the shelf, not out of obligation, but out of peace. That night, I dreamed of walking through a house with many rooms. Some were bright and open, others were dark, locked, long unused. Instead of avoiding them, I carried a key and unlocked each door calmly, one by one. When I woke, I understood the message. I had stopped running from my story. I was owning it. As the anniversary of my husband's funeral approached again, I wondered how I would feel. I expected a heaviness. Instead, what came was reflection. I visited the cemetery briefly, stood quietly, and then left without lingering. My relationship with grief had changed. It no longer demanded center stage. Driving away, I thought about Clara for the first time in a while. I hoped she was well. I hoped she had found the peace she was searching for. Wishing her well no longer felt like a contradiction. It felt like closure. Later that evening, I wrote in my journal again. I wrote about identity, how easy it is to lose yourself inside roles like wife, caretaker, peacemaker. I wrote about how betrayal doesn't just fracture trust in others, it fractures trust in yourself, and how rebuilding that self-trust is the real work of healing. I wrote until my hand ached, until the thoughts slowed, until silence returned. If I could speak to the woman I was before the funeral, before the truth surfaced, I wouldn't warn her. I wouldn't tell her to be suspicious or guarded. I would tell her this instead. You will survive what you think you can't. You will lose something precious, and in its place, you will find yourself. That knowledge felt like a quiet triumph. As I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The lines on my face were still there. So were the scars you couldn't see. But there was also a steadiness in my eyes that hadn't been there before, a knowing. I turned off the light and lay down feeling grateful, not for the betrayal, not for the pain, but for the growth that followed. Life hadn't given me the story I expected, but it had given me a truer one. And as sleep came, I held on to that truth, letting it settle deep into my bones, ready to carry it forward into whatever came next. Spring arrived quietly that year, as if it didn't want to startle me. The mornings softened first. Light lingered longer on the kitchen counter. I noticed it while standing at the sink one morning, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching the neighborhood wake up. There was a time when mornings felt heavy, like something I had to survive before the day could begin. Now they felt like an invitation. I had begun volunteering at the community center twice a week, helping facilitate small discussion circles for women navigating life changes, divorce, widowhood, empty nests, reinvention. I never positioned myself as an expert. I just listened, and when I spoke honestly. I told them that healing doesn't always look brave. Sometimes it looks like getting out of bed. Sometimes it looks like saying no without explaining yourself. One afternoon, a woman named Denise stayed behind after the group ended. She was around my age, her eyes tired in a way I recognized immediately. "How did you stop blaming yourself?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. I thought about all the nights I had replayed conversations, searching for the moment where I must have failed. "I didn't stop all at once," I said finally. "I started by asking a different question. Not, what did I do wrong, but what did I tolerate that hurt me? That changed everything." She nodded slowly, like something inside her had clicked. Watching that recognition bloom in someone else felt quietly miraculous. At home, I continued reshaping my space, not dramatically, but intentionally. I moved furniture, hung new artwork, donated things that carried weight I no longer needed. Each small change felt like reclaiming territory. This was my life, my rhythm, my story, told in my own time. My relationship continued to grow with care. We didn't see each other every day. We didn't need to. When we were together, there was presence. When we weren't, there was trust. One evening, over dinner, he asked me what scared me now. I considered the question. "Losing myself again," I said, not noticing when I start shrinking. He didn't rush to reassure me. He just said, "If that ever happens, I want you to tell me." That answer mattered, not because it promised perfection, but because it made room for honesty. Around that time, my daughter confided something to me. She told me she had ended a relationship that didn't feel right. "I kept thinking about what you went through," she said, "and I realized I didn't want to ignore my instincts just to keep the peace." I felt a swell of emotion rise in my chest. This, I thought, is how cycles change, quietly, one choice at a time. There were still moments when grief surfaced unexpectedly, a song on the radio, a familiar phrase, the way certain dates still carried an echo. But those moments passed more easily now. They didn't pull me under. They reminded me of where I'd been, not where I was stuck. One afternoon, I ran into someone from my past while grocery shopping, an old family friend who had known my husband well. We exchanged pleasantries, and then, hesitantly, she said, "I'm sorry for everything that came out after he passed." I met her gaze and smiled gently. "So am I, but I'm okay." She looked surprised, not because I was pretending, but because I meant it. Later that day, I thought about how often we underestimate the power of simply being okay. Not ecstatic, not triumphant, just grounded, content, whole. As summer approached, I planned a short solo trip. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet town by the water. I wanted to see how it felt to be alone somewhere new, not out of loneliness, but out of curiosity. The first evening there, I sat on a bench overlooking the shoreline as the sun dipped low. I thought about all the versions of myself that brought me here. the woman who loved deeply, the woman who trusted, the woman who broke, the woman who rebuilt. None of them were wrong. They were all necessary. I wrote postcards to my children, not with updates, but with reflections. I told them how proud I was of the people they were becoming. I told them that honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is a form of love. I told them that their worth would never be measured by how much they endured in silence. On my last day there, I woke early and walked along the shore. The water was calm, the air cool. I felt present in my body in a way that had been missing for years. Grief had once lived there, tight and heavy. Now there was space. When I returned home, life resumed its gentle rhythm. Volunteer work, family dinners, quiet evenings. I realized then that I wasn't waiting for anything. Not answers, not validation, not permission. One night, while journaling, I wrote a sentence that stopped me mid-page. I trust myself. I underlined it twice. That trust was the real casualty of the betrayal, and restoring it had been the real victory. If someone had told me on the day of the funeral that I would one day feel this steady, I wouldn't have believed them. I would have thought strength looked louder, more dramatic. I didn't know it could feel like this, like breathing without bracing, like standing without armor. I closed my journal and sat quietly listening to the sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, ordinary sounds anchoring me in the present. My story didn't end when the truth came out. It began again, slower, wiser, more honest. And as I turned out the light that night, I felt something settle over me, not relief, not triumph, but a deep, abiding peace. The kind that doesn't demand attention, the kind that simply stays. There are moments when you realize you've crossed an invisible line, not because anything dramatic happens, but because something inside you finally goes quiet. That was how the next chapter of my life began. Not with fireworks, not with declarations, but with a calm certainty that I was no longer living in reaction to my past. It showed up in small ways first. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head before conversations. I stopped anticipating disappointment. I stopped scanning rooms for danger that no longer existed. I noticed myself laughing without that split-second hesitation, the one where you check whether joy is allowed. One afternoon, my sister came over unannounced, holding a box of old photographs she'd found while cleaning out her garage. We spread them across the dining table. There were decades of memories there. Birthdays, holidays, vacations, smiles frozen in time, unaware of what would come later. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest as I looked at one picture of my husband, his arm around me, both of us laughing at something outside the frame. For a moment, I wondered if I should feel angry at that version of him, or foolish for loving him. Instead, I felt something else entirely: compassion, for the woman I was then, for how sincerely she loved, for how deeply she believed in the life she was building. My sister watched my face carefully. "You okay?" she asked. "I am," I said, and it surprised both of us. We talked that afternoon about things we hadn't said out loud before, about how secrets ripple through families, about how women are taught to endure quietly, to keep things together at any cost, about how strength gets mistaken for silence. Later that week, I received an email from the lawyer confirming the final closure of all remaining paperwork. No more loose ends, no more documents needing signatures. It was done. I read the message once, then archived it. Not ceremoniously, just practically. That chapter didn't need a shrine. I had started mentoring a younger woman at the community center, someone navigating a relationship that felt wrong but looked perfect on the outside. She reminded me so much of myself that it sometimes hurt to listen. One day she asked me, "How do you know when it's time to walk away?" I told her the truth. When you start betraying yourself to keep someone else comfortable. She went quiet. I let the silence do its work. My relationship continued to deepen, not because we were chasing something, but because we were allowing it to unfold naturally. There were no grand promises, no future tripping, just consistency, care, presence, the things I once thought were boring and now recognized as priceless. One evening, while sitting on the porch as dusk settled in, he said, "You know, you don't flinch anymore." I laughed softly. I didn't realize I was flinching. He said, "You were," gently, like you were always waiting for something to fall apart. I thought about that later, about how trauma teaches the body to stay alert long after the danger is gone. Healing, I was learning, is teaching yourself that it's safe to rest. My daughter visited the following weekend. We cooked together, music playing softly in the background. At one point, she paused, spoon in hand, and said, "I'm really proud of you." The words caught me off guard. Parents are supposed to say that, not the other way around. "For what?" I asked. "For choosing yourself," she said, "for not letting what happened harden you." I swallowed the lump in my throat and kept stirring the pot. Some emotions are too big to meet head-on. That night, after she went to bed, I sat alone in the living room and thought about legacy. Not the kind written into wills, but the kind passed through behavior, the lessons children absorb without being taught. I realized then that my healing wasn't just for me. It was a message, a permission slip. As autumn returned, marking another year, I found myself reflecting on the woman who stood at that funeral, blindsided by a truth she never asked for. She had felt foolish, small, disposable. She had thought the betrayal defined her. Now, looking back, I could see that moment differently. It wasn't the end of my dignity, it was the beginning of my clarity. I began writing again, not for publication, not for an audience, but for myself. I wrote about love without romance, about grief without bitterness, about forgiveness that doesn't require reconciliation. I wrote about the difference between secrecy and privacy, between loyalty and self-erasure. One entry stood out. I had written, "You can mourn the life you thought you had without discrediting the life you're building now." Reading it back felt like a benediction. There were still people who didn't understand my calm, who expected rage or revenge or collapse. Some even seemed disappointed that I hadn't turned my pain into spectacle. I let that go too. My healing didn't need an audience. During a family gathering, a distant relative made an offhand comment about how men are just like that sometimes, referring to my husband's double life. The old me might have swallowed the discomfort to keep things smooth. Instead, I said, evenly, "No, people make choices, and those choices have consequences." The table went quiet. Then the conversation moved on. It was a small moment, but it mattered. My voice no longer trembled when I used it. As winter approached again, I felt a sense of completion settle in. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was honest. My life fit me now. It didn't require contortions. One evening, I stood in front of the mirror before bed and really looked at myself. The lines on my face told a story, not just of age, but of survival, of endurance, of wisdom earned the hard way. I smiled at my reflection, not out of vanity, but recognition. I knew this woman. I trusted her. The truth I uncovered at that funeral shattered the illusion I had been living in. But illusions, I've learned, are fragile by nature. Reality, though painful, is solid. It gives you something to stand on. I turned off the light and slipped into bed, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a day lived fully, honestly. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges, its own joys. I didn't need to control them. I only needed to meet them as myself. And that finally felt like enough. The final stretch of healing doesn't announce itself. There's no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no moment where someone hands you a certificate and says, "You're done now." Instead, it reveals itself in how you move through the world without thinking about it, and how your shoulders sit lower, and how your breath comes easier, and how your thoughts stop circling the same old wounds. That winter was gentle with me. Cold, yes, but steady. I found comfort in routine. Morning walks, even when the air bit at my cheeks, a warm kitchen in the evenings, books I read slowly, letting the words sink in. There was a time when stillness felt dangerous, like it would invite grief back in. Now, stillness felt like home. I received a message from the woman who had once shared my husband's secret life. Not an apology exactly, but something close. She wrote that she had been thinking about me, that the weight of everything had caught up to her, that she hoped I was finding peace. I sat with the message for a long time before responding, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to be sure my words came from truth, not habit. Finally, I replied simply, "I am at peace. I hope you find your way there too." I didn't ask questions. I didn't reopen doors. Compassion doesn't require access. At the community center, one of the facilitators asked if I would consider leading a monthly storytelling circle. "You have a way of making people feel less alone," she said. I agreed, though the idea scared me a little. Sharing pieces of myself publicly still felt tender. But when the first circle gathered and women began speaking about their own hidden griefs, I understood why I'd been asked. Stories, when shared carefully, don't reopen wounds. They remind us where we've survived. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, I drove home in silence. I realized then that the thing that once nearly destroyed me had become the very thing that connected me to others. Pain hadn't disappeared, but it had been transformed. My relationship settled into something quiet and sturdy. We talked about the future, not in sweeping promises, but in practical hopes. Travel, shared projects, growing older without pretense. There was no rush. We were already where we needed to be. One night, he asked me if I ever wished things had been different, if I wished my husband had been honest, faithful, simpler. I thought about it. "I wish I hadn't been lied to," I said, "but I don't wish away the woman I became because of it." That answer surprised me, and then it grounded me. My children continued to build their lives, carrying forward lessons they hadn't asked for, but had absorbed nonetheless. I watched them set boundaries, ask hard questions, choose partners with care. I didn't interfere. I trusted the example I'd lived. As the anniversary of the funeral approached, I noticed it didn't loom the way it once had. The date arrived quietly. I marked it not with sorrow, but with intention. I lit a candle that evening, not for him, but for myself, for the woman who survived a truth that could have hollowed her out and instead used it to become whole. I sat by the window, flame flickering softly, and allowed myself to feel everything without judgment. Gratitude, sadness, pride, relief. They all belonged. In the months that followed, I made decisions with a clarity that once felt impossible. I said no when something didn't align. I said yes when something felt expansive. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. At a family gathering, someone new asked me about my past. The old me might have edited the story to make others comfortable. This time, I told the truth simply, without embellishment or defensiveness. When they expressed sympathy, I thanked them and changed the subject. My story no longer needed to be processed by strangers. One afternoon, while organizing my closet, I came across an old jacket of his. I must have missed it during earlier purges. I held it for a moment, breathing in the faint, familiar scent. There was a time when that smell would have undone me. Now it stirred only memory, not longing. I placed the jacket in a donation bag and tied it shut, not with ceremony, with closure. As spring returned once more, I felt a quiet excitement for the future, not because I was chasing happiness, but because I trusted myself to meet whatever came next. That trust was hard-won and unshakable. I began to understand that betrayal hadn't stolen my life. It had stripped away the illusion that my worth depended on someone else's choices. What remained was solid, unnegotiable. On a warm evening, sitting on the porch as the sky darkened, I reflected on the journey I had taken. From shock to grief, from anger to clarity, from survival to peace. It hadn't been linear, it hadn't been graceful, but it had been honest. If someone listening to my story is standing where I once stood, blindsided, questioning everything, I want you to know this. The truth, however brutal, can become a doorway, not to the life you imagined, but to the life that is actually yours. You don't have to rush. You don't have to forgive. You don't have to be strong all the time. You only have to keep choosing yourself, one small, brave choice at a time. That is how healing happens, not all at once, but completely. There is a quiet kind of strength that settles in when you stop measuring your life by what was taken from you and start honoring what you carried through. That strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't seek witnesses. It simply becomes the way you stand, the way you speak, the way you choose. By the time another year had passed, the story of my husband's funeral no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like a scar, still visible, still meaningful, but no longer painful to the touch. Scars don't ask to be erased, they ask to be understood. I had learned to live with the truth without letting it define the edges of my days. I could speak his name without my chest tightening. I could remember the good without excusing the harm. Both could exist at the same time. That balance took time and patience and more grace for myself than I ever thought I deserved. One afternoon, while walking through the park, I passed a couple arguing quietly near a bench. The woman's shoulders were tense, her voice tight with something unsaid. I didn't know their story, but I recognized the posture, the way she was making herself smaller to keep something together. I felt a familiar ache of recognition, and then a surge of gratitude that it was no longer my posture. I kept walking, breathing in the crisp air, grounded in my own body. The storytelling circle at the community center had grown. More women came each month. Some just listened, some cried, some spoke for the first time about things they'd carried for years. I never told them what to do. I simply reminded them that their feelings made sense. That truth, spoken gently, can be more powerful than advice. After one session, a woman approached me and said, "Your story gave me permission to stop pretending." That sentence stayed with me because pretending had nearly cost me my life, not my existence, but my essence, and letting go of that performance had been the beginning of everything that followed. My relationship continued, steady and unremarkable in the best way. We shared laughter, quiet disagreements, mutual respect. There was no pedestal, no illusion, just two people choosing honesty again and again. I didn't need him to save me. I wanted him beside me. That difference mattered. My children thrived in ways that reassured me I hadn't failed them by staying too long or by leaving too late. They had seen pain, yes, but they had also seen resilience. They had seen accountability. They had seen their mother choose dignity over denial. One evening, my son called just to talk. No crisis, no agenda, just connection. As we spoke, I realized how far we'd all come, from whispered confusion to open conversation. That, to me, was redemption. I kept writing, not every day, but often enough to stay honest with myself. I wrote letters I never sent. I wrote truths I didn't need to explain. I wrote reminders to the woman I once was, telling her she wasn't foolish for trusting, that love given freely is never a mistake. If I could speak to her now, the woman standing at that funeral, blindsided and shaking, I would tell her this: you are not about to disappear, you are about to arrive. The life that followed wasn't perfect, but it was mine, built on truth, anchored in self-respect, open to joy without fear of collapse. I stopped asking why it happened. That question no longer served me. Instead, I asked how I wanted to live with what I knew. The answer guided every decision that followed. There is a misconception that closure means forgetting. It doesn't. Closure means remembering without bleeding. It means carrying the past without letting it steer the future. On a quiet morning, I stood once more at the kitchen sink, sunlight stretching across the counter, steam rising from my mug. The same place where months earlier I had first noticed the light returning to my days. This time I smiled, not because everything was easy, but because everything was honest. I had survived a truth that could have shattered me. Instead, it sharpened my sense of self. It taught me that love without truth is not love, and that loyalty to yourself is the foundation of every healthy bond. If you are listening to this and carrying a secret you didn't choose or a betrayal you didn't earn, I want you to hear this clearly. Your story is not over, and it does not end in shame. Sometimes the truth arrives too late to save what you had, but it arrives right on time to save who you are. I turned away from the window, ready for the day, steady in my steps, not because the past no longer mattered, but because it no longer controlled me. And that, in the end, was the greatest inheritance I could give myself.